let's talk budget. The fine print is still being examined, the details are emerging, and consensus is actually growing that this was, after all, a pretty good budget. Now, I know on the day of the budget, everyone gives a thumbs up immediately right after the speech. All the schemes sound very good. And then it takes a few hours, maybe a day, to figure out where the devil in the details are. This time round, it seems like it, on the face of it at least, that the devil in the details are very minimal, if at all. It truly seems to be quite a forthcoming budget in terms of gesture, in terms of directions. Of course, implementation is the big question that remains. So helping us break down the budget now is Arvind Panagriya. He's a former VC of the Niti Aayog and professor at Columbia University. Sir, welcome to the show. Happy to speak to you as always. Let me begin by talking about the 9.5% fiscal deficit figure straight off. I can't remember a budget where people are so happy that the fiscal deficit is at 9.5% merely because of the fact that the government has been honest about it. Essentially, that's at the basis of the cheering that is going on. How do you see that figure? How do you see the transparency that has come in? And is the 9.5% for this year, 6.8% for next year worrying you in any way?
As you know, I've been a fiscal conservative, but in this case, I'm quite okay with both the numbers. Because of COVID, we had expected that the tax revenue collection would be poor. And the expenditures had to be maintained. And that is precisely what the government has done. And I think the cheer for, transparency has to be there. When people say 9.8, they're happy with, partly they are saying that, look, finally the government has recognized that there are a lot of off-budget items which previously were not included in calculating the fiscal deficit. The government has now introduced full transparency, and that's a good thing for the future. It bodes well. I also think that you mentioned the devil in the detail. One detail actually, which is not devil but angel, is the fact that in the last quarter of the current year, which is January to March, the expenditure, according to revised estimates, is about twice of what it was a year ago during the same January to March months. If the government actually pulls off those expenditures, they will go a long way towards stimulating the economy, because workers are still returning to their workplaces, and this is a good time that demand would help. As for the next year's deficit, once again, this is intended to give a hand to the economy while it pulls out of the decline that COVID had induced. And that's a good thing. Almost everyone, myself included, was actually suggesting that we ought to raise the expenditures, and they have chosen to spend it on the right things, health and infrastructure. So no complaints.
All right. Now, so what have they chosen to spend it on? Of course, the capital expenditure is supposed to be the highest in the decade. The other segment, which on the face of it has got a big chunk, is healthcare, which everyone said it should be 137% up. So over 2 lakh crore rupees for healthcare. But when you go into the details, you see that includes a little over 60,000 crore rupees for drinking water and sanitization, close to 3,000 crore rupees for nutrition, 49,000 crore rupees for finance commission grants. Then the vaccine chunk also comes out of the same pie. And many have pointed out that if you compare the healthcare allocation, which goes to the ministry, compared to what we spent in this year, the revised estimates, it's actually a 10% drop. Do you think there could have been a more clearer and transparent push on healthcare as well?
Well, look, you have counted all the major expenditure heads, and almost all of them really relate to public health. which is what the government ought to be spending on. In India, healthcare otherwise is, particularly hospital care, is largely private, meaning that we spend the individuals and households spend out of their own pocket. And we have been underspending by a wide margin compared to all other countries on health sector. The government, that is, the public expenditures have been far below what the other countries spend. So, this is a move in the correct direction. And certainly, the expenditure, for example, on vaccines, 35,000 crore, is something very important. I had been myself calling for, expenditures in this range, $5 billion to $10 billion is what I was calling for. And this is certainly, on the lower side of that, 5 billion at least. So, and water, bringing drinking water by the tap to everybody, every Indian citizen, that again is a public health issue. So I think these are all expenditures on the correct items. I have no reservations about those. How well we do now, also, by the way, we should factor in the fact that going by what the Modi government has done in the last 6 years, its record on delivery, meaning, spending it wisely and ultimately delivering the services that match the expenditures incurred, has been quite good. And and that sort of also makes me feel that perhaps, the central government is an able government right now. And it's not a bad thing for it to be carrying out these expenditures.
Yeah. The big game changer really has been the unabashed return of the word privatization in a public policy document, and it's a controversial one. So, clear intent to privatize 2 public sector banks. We're still waiting to know what the names are, but there are some reports, and ET Now is reporting that what the possible candidates could be. On the other hand, you also have now clear policy in place that you will have public sector enterprises essentially in 4 core sectors. Do you think this will be easier said than done? The kind of pushback that the government will face, there will have to be change in legislation also, at least for the PSBs. Is it feasible to actually pull this off?
No, I think that's a very, very good question. And certainly, one that ought to be asked in view of the experience so far, in view of the performance of the government to deliver on what it intended to date. That has not been great. Air India privatization is still struggling. And since 2016, when I was still at the Niti Aayog, the cabinet had begun to support several PSUs had been actually approved by the cabinet, but action has not happened. So some sort of skepticism is legitimate. But I think, we can be a bit optimistic. For the first time, the government has really gone out on its limb to actually outline a very, very bold policy. This is regarding the public sector enterprises, but it is then complemented also by these announcements on the public sector banks. Unprecedented, this kind of privatization of banks has never been even talked about, let alone, I am probably one of the few who has sort of for quite a while talked about this kind of privatization of the banks. But at the government level, that has never been talked about, I'm not so surprised because during my years in New Delhi, I had enough exposure to the Prime Minister, and I fully sort of, I think he was waiting for the right moment. So some skepticism legitimate, but on the other hand, I must say that the public, particularly the policy announced on public sector enterprises, is really the kind of document that rivals the new industrial policy that had been announced in 1991 by Prime Minister Narasimha Rao. So it really, just imagine the implications. Textiles ministry eventually will not be there if the policy is implemented. Perhaps steel ministry will not be there if the policy is implemented, as I sort of understand it. So it really has far-reaching implications. I must say, overall, in a way, what we are seeing in Modi 2.0, including, the reforms on labor laws and the farm bills, etc., that have been passed, the 2014 candidate Narendra Modi that we had seen, that's the kind of reforms that we had hoped for at that time during that campaign. And that has now all come true in Modi 2.0.
Again, follow up on implementation. The aim to sell, for example, Air India in this year in a post-COVID world. Do you think they can pull it off? Disinvestment has always made a big presence in all of these budget and policy statements, but they haven't really managed to do it for a variety of reasons. Do you think any of those reasons are now receding?
Well, I think progress has been made. Perhaps originally even I underestimated the kinds of hurdles that you have to go through. Not to mention the hesitation on the part of many officers to, not be responsible for these sales. But progress has been made. I think, the kind of offer now that is there on the table on Air in India, I'm reasonably optimistic that we'll see that sale go through. BPCL hopefully will happen as well. Although, let me also say, since implementation is what you're asking me about, I now really think that we need a separate Ministry of Disinvestment. I think this program that has been laid out between the public sector banks and the public sector enterprises policy is so large and will require several years of work that I think it really requires a separate ministry to do it. And when you actually create that ministry, which will then have to be evaluated by its success in privatization, then things will actually move. So this is something I had argued even before the budget, but after having seen what the budget has given us, I feel even more convinced that we need a separate disinvestment ministry again. We, as you might recall, or certainly would know, that during Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee years, there was a disinvestment ministry, which actually was very successful at privatization. And what we are now talking about is going to far exceed in scale and scope what the Prime Minister Vajpayee's disinvestment ministry had done.
Yeah. You're talking about the disinvestment ministry there and led by Arun Shourie at that time, which was very efficient and successful, but then dogged by, controversy for years later for a number of decisions that were taken. So perhaps that has got officers in government jittery as well. I want to quickly talk about the other big game changer, with the caveat that it needs to be implemented properly, which is the asset reconstruction company for bad loans or bad assets, the bad bank as people are talking about it. Feasibility, what should it look like?
Okay, I think that is for experts to decide what it should look like, and these have been discussed now by several on several other television programs. But the basic purpose, I think, is very sensible one, and it is well timed, I should say, because I was myself at the forefront of this, saying that, look, bad assets are going to accumulate again from post-COVID bankruptcies, and therefore this time we need to be need to take action in advance rather than delay by many years. We already had seen this. In 2015, where we are very slow. I was arguing very much for at that time, probably the lone person inside the government for an asset reconstruction company at that time. And at that time, we didn't even have the IBC in place. So it was very much needed. But there was not enough appreciation in the finance ministry, in the PMO, and also it didn't happen at the time. But we are again in a situation similar to 2015, given that these bankruptcies will happen. So well timed, and also some recapitalization has been allocated. Some 20,000 crore. Perhaps we would need a little more. But that all depends on how actually this ARC is structured. How much the government has to invest in it and so forth. Right now, as far as I understand, the Secretary of DFS was talking in terms of a limited investment by the government of about 100 crore rupees, which is in the budget. And he's saying that, the banks themselves will have to pitch in a good bit, and they will have to do the provisioning for the assets that get moved into the ARC and so forth. So we'll see. I'm not an expert on that subject in terms of how exactly it should be structured. And I certainly, as a trade economist, fully believe in comparative advantage.
You sound very thrilled, almost, if I may say so. Mr. Panagriya, you sound very thrilled and almost as if everything that you were looking at and wanted to do in your stint in 2015 is kind of coming to fruition now. Am I correct? Or at least some key points?
Absolutely. If I were to use a bit exaggerated term, I would say it is a mind-blowing budget, at least for me. So yes, and I'm glad the excitement comes through in your voice.
Okay, in the middle of this mind-blowing budget, I have to point out some criticism that is coming in from the poor, beleaguered, middle-class income taxpayer who got no relief at all, and in fact will be penalized, or one section of taxpayers will now be penalized for investing in retirement as well, with the cap on tax-exempt interest being set for 2.5 lakh rupees. Do you think that more could have been done to put money in people's hands at this time?
Okay, there are two separate questions. Money in hand, I come to, but first on the taxation. Okay, I mean, you could argue that the direct tax reform is still an outstanding item, and it ought to be on the agenda of the government. But given so much else that the government has put on the table in this budget, maybe this will wait a little bit. But I certainly believe that we need a full, just as we did in the corporate profit tax, slashing the rates and ending the exemptions. That sort of also needs to go on personal income tax because the tax rates at the top end are quite high. 45% kind of tax rate is a bit excessive. That certainly has a dampening impact on wealth creation. And while we want to tax and the government needs the revenues, we ought to work towards broadening the base. So that's on the tax side. On the putting money into the hands of the people, in a sense, I think this is especially with respect to the stimulus effect. I think there have been some complaints that, somehow this, if we spend on infrastructure and if the government, rather than transfer some of the money to the customers or households themselves, spends on its own, then the stimulus will take a much longer time and it might be a little too late. I'm not so pessimistic on this. For one, when if transfers are made, at least these are obviously one-time kind of transfers we are talking about. And much of the evidence from the United States, because the United States has tried these one-time transfers in the past, not just during COVID, but in previous year, in several previous episodes as well of recessions. And it has never been successful because, when people get a one-time increase in their incomes, that simply doesn't change their consumption profile. The economists call something called the permanent income, which is, their long-term income. And then consumption is very much determined by their long-term incomes. So it's not clear actually that, one-time transfer would have resulted actually in demand stimulation. On the other hand, as I mentioned, the government is actually going to spend, if it gets realized, in the current quarter, which is the last quarter of fiscal year 21, twice of what is spent in January, March 2020. Now, that is a very large stimulus upfront, even before the year actually begins. Plus, I think what the government ought to do is to, clear all its dues very rapidly, starting now. Why wait for the next year? What is due has to be given back to the people. Anyway, these are things like, tax refunds of individuals, which are probably in trillion rupees, not meaning, lakh rupees, lakh crore rupees. Then there are arrears to the states in terms of the GST revenue that's outstanding. A lot of dues, overdues on goods and services that companies have already provided.
I get the general idea.
Fertilizer subsidy dues. So the number of these, if we bring them, these are, if these are clear, they will be spent very quickly. So that will translate actually in a stimulus right away.
Okay.
So those are the things the government can still do within the current budget.
All right. So and to be fair, there was no great expectation of a tax cut in a post-pandemic year. At least there has been no tax raise. So those are small mercies. Thank you so much, Arvind Panagriya, for speaking with us and joining us to decode what you call a mind-blowing budget and go into the details of how you see this changing things as they pan out for the Indian economy.